My name is Lily Harmon, and I am 29 years old. 6 months ago, my mother sat across from me in my own kitchen, set a box of store-bought cookies on my counter, smiled the way only mothers are supposed to smile, and told me she had missed me. While somewhere inside the large black Nike bag she had quietly carried through my front door, a digital timer was already counting down toward the night she had planned to collect $150,000 in insurance money off the ashes of my life. She had forged my signature on a beneficiary change form 6 months before that visit, rerouting the entire payout of my renter's insurance policy into her own bank account without my knowledge, without my consent, without a single word. And then she walked into my apartment with that bag, moved through every room the way a person moves through a space they are already imagining destroyed, and made sure everything was in place. 5 days later, at 3:17 in the morning, I woke up to smoke pouring under my bedroom door and fire devouring everything I had spent 7 years building from nothing. And when I called her from a frozen Brooklyn sidewalk in 18-degree cold, wearing nothing but thin cotton pajamas, with no shoes, no coat, and nothing in my hands but a borrowed emergency blanket and my phone, my own mother said 7 words that I will carry inside my chest for the rest of my life. This isn't our problem. Be more careful. She didn't just abandon me on that sidewalk. She had been planning it for 6 months. Before I go any further, if that hits you like a punch straight to the chest, go ahead and hit that like button right now. Subscribe so you don't miss a single word of what I'm about to tell you. And drop a comment right now telling me where you're listening from tonight. Now let me take you back to the night everything changed. The smoke alarm in Unit 4B of my Park Slope walk-up screamed to life at 3:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in mid-February. And the sound wasn't just loud. It was a physical violation, a high-pitched mechanical shriek that drilled directly through sleep and into the base of the skull. The kind of sound your nervous system recognizes before your conscious mind has the chance to form a single coherent thought. I jerked awake into a darkness so complete and so thick, I could taste it on the back of my tongue. A heaviness in the air that had a texture, a chemical weight. The sharp, acrid smell of burning industrial carpet and synthetic materials superheated past the point of no return. My lungs understood what was happening before my brain did, and that half-second gap between sensation and comprehension, that is where terror lives. My hand found my phone on the nightstand in the dark, and then my body was already moving, already at the door, already pressing the back of my wrist against the surface of the wood to feel for heat the way I'd read you were supposed to in some fire safety pamphlet I'd been handed in the 6th grade and never thought I'd need. The hallway beyond my door was a tunnel of black smoke shot through with an orange glow that rose from somewhere 3 floors below. And the heat that pressed against my face when I opened that door was not the heat of a warm room. It was a warning, the leading edge of something enormous and indifferent and consuming. I didn't think about my portfolio, didn't think about the 3 years of design work saved on my laptop, didn't think about the Gibson J45 acoustic my biological father had left me when I was 11 years old, the only object in the apartment I could never replace with money. Adrenaline is a radical editor. It cuts everything that isn't survival. I ran barefoot in thin cotton pajamas I'd bought on clearance at a Target in Flatbush, and I hit the stairwell door with my shoulder, hard enough that I'd feel the bruise for 2 weeks. The stairwell was its own particular hell. The heavy, fire-rated steel door felt cold as a slab of ice under my palm for exactly 1 second before the heat coming through the wall made it burn, and the roar of the fire inside the building structure was something I had no reference for before that night. A low-frequency, hungry rumble that vibrated through the concrete beneath my bare feet, a sound that resembled a freight train passing directly through the building's bones. 4 flights down in smoke so thick my eyes streamed before I reached the second landing, each breath a calculated gamble, each step a prayer directed at no one in particular, until the heavy exterior door gave way and the February air of Brooklyn hit my face like a slap from an open hand. The temperature was 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and the contrast between the heat at my back and the freezing night against my skin made the world feel briefly, violently unreal. Like the air itself had broken into two incompatible states, and I was standing on the fault line between them. I stood on the sidewalk, and I watched fire come through the fourth-floor window of my building. Watched the glass of Unit 4B blow outward in a sound like a single gunshot, the shards catching the orange light as they fell, and scattered across the frozen pavement in a pattern that glittered under the streetlights, like something almost beautiful, which was a thought that arrived and departed in the same instant because there was nothing beautiful about what I was watching. 7 years of my life were inside that apartment. 3 years of design work, hand-drawn schematics, client mood boards, sample materials, the physical binders I'd built project by project at the firm in Midtown. Every photograph I owned of my biological father. The Gibson J45 he had left me, a 1971 model, dark sunburst finish, with a small crack in the headstock he'd repaired himself with wood glue and patience. The one object in the world I would have run back into a burning building for if I had known it was going to be taken from me. My college diploma. My laptop, with its 3 years of backed-up client files and half-finished personal projects. All of it now inside the orange glow of Unit 4B, being consumed at a rate I couldn't comprehend while I stood on a public sidewalk in my pajamas, unable to produce a single coherent word. A firefighter from FDNY Engine 280 approached me with the particular grimness of a man doing a job he has done enough times that the horror has been replaced by a different, quieter kind of sorrow. He looked exhausted the way first responders look exhausted after an hour on scene. His turnout gear coated in a layer of frozen spray and soot, his face beneath the helmet carrying the weight of information he was about to deliver. When he confirmed that everything in Unit 4B was gone, the word "gone" arrived in my mind and simply didn't fit. It was too small a word for the size of the void it was describing, the way the word "loss" is always structurally inadequate for the actual weight of what it represents. I sank onto the curb because my legs stopped cooperating, and someone whose face I don't remember draped a scratchy wool emergency blanket over my shoulders that smelled of mothballs and old truck upholstery. And I sat there with my phone in my hand, watching the flashing red and blue lights of the FDNY trucks paint the snow in rhythmic pulses, while the minutes moved from 3:47 to 4 to 4:15, and the fire kept burning. I called my mother, because that is what you do when the world burns down, no matter how old you are, no matter how long the silences between you have stretched. You call home, because home is supposed to be the one place that exists outside the physics of catastrophe. The one number that answers on the first ring and says, "I'm coming," before you've finished explaining. The phone rang 8 times before she picked up. Her voice was thick with sleep and something else I recognized immediately: annoyance. The particular annoyance of someone interrupted during something they had been doing without disturbance, something they did not want broken. She said my full name, Lily, in the flat, slightly sharpened tone she reserved for telemarketing calls and disappointments. I told her about the fire, about the smoke, about standing on a frozen sidewalk with nothing but my phone and the clothes on my back and a stranger's blanket. And I told her I had nowhere to go. And there was a long silence on the other end of the line that I can only describe as the absence of everything a mother's silence should never be. "That's unfortunate," she said. "You really should have been more careful." And then she handed the phone to Owen Mercer, the man she'd married 6 years ago, a former securities broker whose career had been quietly unraveling for reasons I didn't fully understand yet. And Owen's voice came through flat and final, and delivered with the practiced neutrality of a man who had made a decision he intended to stick to, telling me that this was not their problem, that the American dream was built on self-reliance, and that I had clearly failed the test. The line went dead. I pressed the phone against my ear for a long time after that, listening to silence, because the dial tone felt more honest than their voices had. As the sky above Brooklyn began to shift from black to the sickly orange-gray of pre-dawn, something surfaced in my memory that I had been unconsciously pushing down since the moment the smoke alarm had woken me. The visit, 5 days ago, my mother standing in my apartment for the first time in 2 years. She had arrived unannounced on a Wednesday afternoon with a box of store-bought sugar cookies and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. And I had been so relieved to see her that I had made tea and set out the cookies on a plate and let myself believe, genuinely believe, that the 2 years of near silence between us were finally giving way to something different, something repaired. She had walked through every room with a focused, deliberate attention that I had interpreted as interest. She had asked about my new MacBook, asked whether the building had a sprinkler system, stood at my bedroom window and looked out at the street below with an expression I had read as nostalgia. She had stayed for what she said was 30 minutes. I had felt grateful. Now, sitting on that frozen curb, I turned that memory over carefully, the way you turn over something found in the dark to see what it is in the light. And I felt the first cold edge of a question I wasn't ready to ask yet. Cole Warren was the person who saved me during that first week, in the specific way that only a person with a genuinely good heart and absolutely no interest in receiving credit for it can save someone. Without ceremony, without conditions, without a single question asked. He was my project coordinator at the firm, a man who moved through the social landscape of New York with a kind of unhurried steadiness that made everyone around him calmer. And when I showed up at the door of his walk-up apartment in Astoria at 6 o'clock in the morning, with ash still in my hair and my eyes red from soot, and nothing in my hands but my phone and that wool blanket, he stepped aside without a word and let me in. The apartment smelled of old paperbacks and strong espresso, and after the suffocating chemical smell that had bonded itself to my pores and my hair and my memory, it was the most restorative thing I had ever inhaled. He handed me a venti black coffee from the 24-hour Starbucks on the corner, the heat of the cup the only thing keeping my hands from shaking uncontrollably, and told me to stay as long as I needed, that there was an air mattress, extra hoodies, food in the fridge, and absolutely no obligation to have any conversation about logistics until I was ready. 3 days later, I finally felt functional enough to deal with the insurance, which meant sitting down at Cole's borrowed laptop with clean fingernails and a mind still operating at about 60% capacity to call my renter's insurance company and begin the process of filing a claim. I had been braced for bureaucratic purgatory, hold music and automated menus, and the kind of institutional indifference that makes catastrophe feel additionally cruel. But the claims specialist, a man named Aaron with a careful Midwestern voice that carried a specific quality of deliberateness, asked me a question before I had finished explaining the situation. A question so unexpected that I stopped mid-sentence and sat very still. He asked me to confirm my relationship with Sandra Harmon and Owen Mercer. The silence that followed that question was the kind of silence that carries its own weight, the kind that a doctor lets settle before delivering a diagnosis. And in the 2 or 3 seconds that Aaron's question sat in the air between us, something in my chest shifted. Not panic yet, but the precursor to panic. The cold recognition that the ground beneath a situation is not as solid as you believed it to be. I told him they were my mother and stepfather. He told me I needed to come into the office in person, that there was something I needed to see, that he was located in a high-rise off 6th Avenue in Midtown, and that it would be better, significantly better, to do this face-to-face. I asked him, sitting in Cole's borrowed NYU sweatshirt with no proper coat and a pair of thrift store sneakers, whether he could simply tell me over the phone what it was. He said no. I made the appointment. Cole found me staring at the wall when he came home from his shift that evening, still in his corporate lanyard with a bag of groceries over one shoulder, and he did the thing he always did. He looked at my face and understood immediately that something had shifted. When I told him what Aaron had said about the beneficiary designation, about the form with my parents' names on it, I watched his expression move from concern to a specific, careful frown. The same expression he wore when he was looking at a project file where something didn't add up. He put the groceries on the counter and said quietly that a beneficiary on a renter's insurance policy made no logical sense, that the policy existed to replace your own belongings, not to pay out to your parents, that this wasn't a life insurance policy with $1 million death benefit, it was coverage for furniture and a laptop and a wardrobe. I hugged my knees to my chest on his couch and said, "Yeah, that's what I thought too." Neither of us said what we were both beginning to think. That night, I barely slept. Every time I drifted close to unconsciousness, I saw my mother's hands trailing across my dresser, her eyes cataloging my living room with the patient, systematic attention of someone who is calculating something. The trip to Midtown the next morning felt like descending into a different kind of pressure. The subway packed with commuters who existed in a parallel universe where nothing catastrophic had recently happened to them, their faces turned toward their phones, their coats expensive and intact, the whole machinery of the city operating at its usual indifferent efficiency around a girl in an oversized hoodie whose entire life had been reduced to a borrowed air mattress and a plastic bag of thrift store clothes. The insurance office was all floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Hudson, the kind of space designed to project stability and permanence, which made the fluorescent lighting inside and Aaron's carefully apologetic expression all the more unsettling when he led me into a small conference room and closed the door. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 30, with wire-rimmed glasses and a silk tie knotted just slightly too tight. And he opened the meeting by saying he was very sorry about my loss, in the careful, pre-formulated way that insurance professionals are trained to express sympathy without creating liability. I told him I hadn't come for condolences. He slid a thick manila folder across the table. I opened it. My policy, my name as the insured, the coverage amounts, the effective dates, all of it standard and familiar until I turned to the last page and found the beneficiary designation, and the names there, and the percentage. Sandra Harmon, Owen Mercer, 100%. The room shifted in a way that had nothing to do with physics. The air felt thinner, my heartbeat suddenly audible in my own ears, my hands flat against the cold laminate of the conference table because I needed to feel something solid and real. I told Aaron this was a mistake, that I had never signed this form, that I had not spoken to my mother in any meaningful way for 2 years, and the idea that I would voluntarily hand her the entire payout of my insurance policy was so structurally absurd it made the forgery almost insulting. Almost. He pointed to the bottom of the page, to a signature that looked like mine, that had the same loops in the L and the same downward slant in the Y. A precise and careful mimicry of my handwriting that would have fooled anyone who didn't know one specific thing. I have used the same brand of 0.5 millimeter felt tip pen to sign every document since college, every check, every lease, every contract. It is an obsessive habit and a matter of tactile consistency, and this signature had been made with a cheap blue ballpoint pen, the ink faintly bleeding into the paper at the edges. A pen I had never held in my life. I had never seen this document. This form had been submitted in person 6 months ago, on a Friday afternoon just before the office closed. Aaron told me one more thing before I left, and he said it quietly, in the tone of someone sharing information that carries risk for both parties in the room. A fire investigator from the Bureau of Fire Investigation had called the office that morning asking about this policy. His name was Dean Alcott. He had been asking about the beneficiary designation and the payout amount and the circumstances of the claim. And the reason a fire investigator was calling an insurance office about a beneficiary form was a reason that I understood in my body before I could form the thought in language. A reason that sat in my chest like something cold and immovable. A reason I could not say out loud yet, because saying it out loud would mean that my mother had not just wanted my money. It would mean she had been willing to watch me burn for it. I need to stop here for just a second, because if the weight of that realization just landed on you the way it landed on me sitting in that conference room, type, "I felt that," in the comments right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because what I found out next is the piece that made everything else make sense. Now let's keep going. Dean Alcott looked exactly like what 22 years of investigating fires in New York City produces. A face that had been weathered by 2 decades of smoke-damaged buildings and the particular human wreckage that comes with them. Sharp eyes that seemed to be permanently in the process of scanning a room for structural failure, and a handshake that communicated absolutely no interest in softening anything. We met at a diner on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, a place that smelled of burnt coffee and rain-wet pavement, and he set down his cup and told me without preamble and without apology that he did not believe my fire was an accident. He took out his phone and showed me photographs I did not want to see. What had been my bedroom, what had been my living room, now black and collapsed and unrecognizable. And he walked me through the V pattern on the remaining drywall, the point of origin near the outlet behind my dresser, the internal copper wiring his team had analyzed and found completely intact, no fraying, no surge damage, no arcing. Nothing that would explain why a fire started at that specific location with that specific pattern of accelerant distribution. He said he had been doing this work for 22 years, and he knew exactly what an accidental grease fire looked like, knew exactly what a faulty space heater produced, and this was neither. When he asked me who had access to my apartment in the week before the fire, I felt my pulse stutter and restart in an uneven rhythm. I told him about the visit. 5 days before, my mother, the first time in 2 years, the store-bought cookies, the 30 minutes that she said it had been. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man placing a piece into a structure he had already begun to see the shape of, and told me that the building's electronic entry logs, the smart lock system, an RFID-based system that my landlord, Mr. Briggs, had installed after a string of package thefts, recorded every single access with a timestamp, and that only 2 individuals had entered Unit 4B in the week before the fire. Me, and a woman using a guest code that had been activated 2 hours before her arrival, matching my mother's description exactly. The betrayal of that detail, the guest code, the fact that she had called ahead not to tell me she was coming, but to ensure she had entry without having to ring the buzzer, without leaving a digital fingerprint tied to her phone number, was a specific and devastating kind of cold. I texted Dean Alcott that night from Cole's air mattress with a single message. There might be something else. His reply came in 40 seconds. Tomorrow, 9 a.m., same diner. Bring the insurance paperwork. The gaslighting campaign, which I later understood had been running on a parallel track to everything else, began the morning after my meeting with Aaron, at 8:15 a.m., when my phone rang and Aunt Claire Webb's name appeared on the screen. Claire was my mother's younger sister, a woman whose fundamental nature was to believe the most emotionally convenient version of any situation, and whose voice, when she said honey, carried the specific softness of a person who had been briefed before calling. She told me, in careful, rounded tones, that my mother had called her the night before, very worried about me, that she had heard I was saying strange things, paranoid things, that the people around me were concerned about a possible psychological break brought on by the trauma of the fire. I sat up straight on Cole's air mattress and told her I hadn't said anything to anyone outside of the fire investigator and the insurance company, and she said that no one was saying I was wrong. They were just worried about my recovery, that trauma could manifest in such unexpected ways, that imagining conspiracy where there wasn't any was actually a very well-documented response to catastrophic loss. The word she kept returning to, the word that my mother had clearly chosen and seeded carefully before making this call, was fragile. I hung up and opened my email and found a message from HR at my firm marked urgent, timestamped 4 minutes before Claire had called. A mandatory wellness review, triggered by an anonymous concern about my mental state, citing erratic behavior reported by family members and a duty of care to ensure workplace safety. The architecture of what my mother was building became visible to me all at once in that moment. The way a pattern hidden in static suddenly resolves into a clear image when your eyes adjust. She was not just trying to collect the insurance money. She was simultaneously building a paper record of my mental instability so that by the time I opened my mouth to point a finger at her, the world would already have been prepared to dismiss me. She was not stealing from me. She was erasing me. And she had been doing it while I stood on a frozen sidewalk calling her name. The anger that arrived in my chest in that moment was not hot. It was the opposite of hot. It was the clarity that comes from absolute zero, liquid nitrogen in the bloodstream, a cold so complete it sharpens everything into edges. I texted Cole 3 words. I have a plan. He was at work. His reply came back in 30 seconds. Tell me everything tonight. The evidence broke open the following morning in Mr. Briggs' basement office, a cramped, windowless room beneath the building that smelled powerfully of pine cleaner and old tobacco, the walls stacked with binders and coils of cable, and the accumulated bureaucratic detritus of a man who had been managing a Brooklyn walk-up for 20 years and had learned to document everything. Mr. Briggs had installed high-definition security cameras in all hallways 2 months before the fire, after a string of package thefts, a decision made out of pure practical paranoia that had produced, entirely accidentally, the most important piece of evidence in a criminal investigation. Dean and I sat in Briggs' cramped office before the small monitor, and we watched my mother walk down the fourth-floor hallway of my building on the afternoon of February 7th, 3 weeks before the arrest that had not yet happened. She carried a large black Nike gym bag over her shoulder, the heavy kind designed for gym equipment or overnight travel, and the weight of it was visible in the way the straps dug into her shoulder and the way she adjusted her grip twice before reaching my door. She glanced around before she entered, a brief, scanning look, left then right, the specific look of a person checking for observation. And then she went inside, and the timestamp on the footage read 2:07 p.m. Mr. Briggs fast-forwarded the footage. My mother emerged from Unit 4B at 5:12 p.m., 3 hours and 5 minutes later, with her designer purse over one arm and a look of controlled exhaustion on her face, and absolutely nothing else. The Nike bag was gone. She had walked in with something that weighed enough to change the angle of her shoulder and walked out with empty hands. And she had told me the visit had lasted 30 minutes and been nothing more than dropping off some mail. On the service entrance camera, she walked to her silver Lexus at 5:15 p.m. and drove away. No bag. Dean made a note in his leather-bound notebook, his handwriting fast and aggressive. He told me the fire investigators had found fragments near the outlet behind my dresser, melted plastic and wiring consistent with a digital appliance timer, the kind used to make a residence appear occupied by cycling lights on and off, and that the serial number had been traced to a batch sold at a Home Depot in Stamford, Connecticut, 3 miles from the house in Greenwich where my mother and Owen lived, purchased 8 days before the fire, in cash. The photograph from the Home Depot security footage was grainy in the way that all retail security footage is grainy, but the posture was familiar, the hair was familiar, and the silk scarf she was wearing, navy blue with a small gold geometric pattern, was one I had given her for Christmas 3 years ago and had seen her wear at least a dozen times since. She had gone to a Home Depot 8 days before the night she intended my apartment to burn, bought a digital timer and accelerant and a bag large enough to carry both, paid in cash the way a person pays in cash when they understand that electronic transactions leave records, and then she had driven to Brooklyn 5 days later with store-bought cookies in one hand and a plan in the other. Pause with me for just a second. Have you ever had someone believe in you and fight for you simply because it was the right thing to do? No obligation, no reward, just someone who stood next to you in the dark and said, "I see what's happening here, and I'm not walking away." If you have, type "not alone" in the comments. And if this story has been gripping you, hit that like and subscribe right now, because the trap my mother believed she had set for me was about to close around her instead. Let's keep going. Blair Voss worked 50 floors above the Hudson River in a glass tower in Midtown, and she operated with the specific lethal precision of someone who had spent 15 years watching insurance fraud cases fall apart in federal court because the wrong documents were handled in the wrong order, and took that knowledge personally. She held the beneficiary change form up to the harsh light of her desk lamp and studied it for a long time before she said anything. What she said was that the signature was good, professional-level mimicry, careful and practiced, but that it was not perfect, and that imperfect forgeries carried their own particular poetry when you knew how to read them. She took out a magnifying glass and traced invisible points on the page and explained hesitation marks to me, the microscopic pauses where a forger's brain overrides the muscle memory of mimicry, the fractional hesitations that appear at the curves and transitions that are most difficult to replicate, the places where the pen slows for a microsecond because the brain is working harder than the hand. My authentic signature was unconscious, she said, fast and fluid, the product of 20 years of writing my own name. This one had at least 3 points of hesitation. And a forensic document examiner who had testified in federal court could prove it. More than the signature, she said, was the submission method. The form had not been mailed. It had been walked into the insurance office and handed over the counter by a woman who told the clerk she was handling paperwork for her daughter, who was too busy with her job at the design firm to come in herself. Blair had already spoken to the clerk, a man in his late 20s with a specific and detailed memory of the transaction, and he had described a woman in her mid-50s with expensive brown hair and a designer trench coat who smelled of Chanel No. 5, a scent that he said reminded him of his grandmother, which was why he remembered it clearly more than 6 months after the fact. Blair put the clerk's description across the desk from me and asked if it rang any bells. I said my mother had been dyeing her gray at an upscale salon in Greenwich for as long as I could remember, and that Chanel No. 5 was the only perfume she had worn for 30 years. Blair's smile when she said the clerk was willing to attempt a photo lineup was the smile of a person who has been building a case in her head from the moment the file landed on her desk. That same evening, I called my mother. I sat on Cole's air mattress in the dim light coming through the blinds from the street lamp outside, and I practiced my voice before I dialed. I needed to sound like the version of myself she believed I still was, uncertain and soft-edged and easily guided, the daughter she had been counting on being too broken by the fire to think clearly. I kept my tone light. I thanked her for the visit, told her it had meant a lot, and then, as if the thought had arrived casually, I mentioned that the fire investigator kept asking about the week before and whether she had noticed anything out of the ordinary in the apartment. Her voice changed at the word investigator, the way a temperature drops before a storm. The warmth drained out of it immediately, and what replaced it was careful and cold and controlled. And she told me not to speak to any investigators without a lawyer, that city bureaucrats loved to twist the words of victims, that I had always been fragile under stress and prone to imagining things. In the background, I could hear the rhythmic clinking of a cocktail shaker, Owen making his evening drink, and then his voice, muffled, asking something about a claims adjuster, and then my mother saying abruptly that she had to go, that Owen needed her, and the line went dead. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. My hands were not shaking. The grief was still there, for my apartment, my father's guitar, the version of my mother I had been hoping she still was. But underneath it, something harder had finished forming, the way concrete finishes curing and becomes load-bearing. I texted Dean Alcott, "We need to talk. I have more information." His reply came in under a minute. "Tomorrow, same diner, 9 a.m. Bring everything." I texted Blair Voss, "The witness identification. How soon?" Her reply, 48 hours. I texted Cole, "I need you to check something in the shared family cloud account." His reply, instantaneous, "Already on it." 3 days before the family gathering in Greenwich, while Dean was processing the warrant application and Blair was walking the insurance clerk through a 6-photo lineup, Cole found what he found in the shared family cloud account my mother had never bothered to delete me from, the one she hadn't changed the password on in years. And what he found there was a series of photographs she had taken on the afternoon of February 7th, photographs of my apartment layout taken from specific angles, my dresser, the outlet behind it, the distance from the window to the entry point, photographs that looked like the documentation of a space taken by someone who needed to remember exactly where things were and how they were arranged, interspersed with a screenshot of a receipt for a digital timer purchased in cash 8 days earlier, and then deleted from her photos, but not from the cloud backup that synced automatically every night at 2 a.m. while she slept. The invitation to the family gathering arrived as a phone call in my mother's warmest voice, the specific warmth she deployed when she needed something from me, honey-toned and careful, wrapped in the language of reconciliation and concern. And she told me that the family had been so worried, that family was all anyone had in difficult times, that she was hosting a small Sunday gathering in Greenwich, a backyard BBQ, my favorite, and that everyone who loved me wanted to be there to show support. I almost laughed. Instead, I said I would be there. The pause that followed my acceptance was a fraction of a second too long, a tiny crack in the performance. I hung up and called Dean immediately. He told me not to confront her. The warrant for her Lexus and the Greenwich property was in process. These things required time in the legal system. I told him I wouldn't confront her. I told him I needed to be standing there when the truth arrived. I parked on the street in front of my mother's Greenwich house on a Sunday afternoon and sat in the borrowed car for a moment, looking at the white siding and the manicured lawn and the American flag on a post by the front door. The full visual vocabulary of suburban American respectability, the exterior narrative of a life that had nothing to hide. 15 cars in the driveway, 15 people inside. 15 individuals whom my mother had spent the preceding 2 weeks preparing, through careful phone calls and precisely worded concern, to receive poor Lily with the particular gentle pity reserved for someone who has had a breakdown. She had done her work thoroughly. I could feel it through the car window. The door opened before I reached it. My mother stood in a cream silk blouse and pearl earrings, her hair perfect, her expression calibrated to exactly the right frequency of maternal worry, and she pulled me into a hug that lasted 3 beats too long, and said my name in a voice designed to carry, not for me, but for the room behind her. Over her shoulder, I saw them arranged across the living room. Aunt Claire in an armchair, Uncle Ray by the bookshelf, Kyle and Dana Webb on the sofa, cousins and family friends scattered across the space in the specific groupings of people who have been briefed and are now waiting for a performance to begin. Every face carried the same expression, the careful, suburban pity of people who have already decided what the story is. Owen Mercer stood by the fireplace nursing a scotch and studying his phone with the focused intentness of a man who is trying very hard to not exist in the room he is currently standing in. Aunt Claire took my hands and whispered something about PTSD manifesting in unexpected ways. Dana mentioned a therapist in Greenwich who specialized in, and here she paused with the specific delicacy of someone reading from a script, delusional recovery. Kyle nodded from the couch, looking at me with the soft, cautious attention of someone told they were in the presence of a live wire. My mother waited until everyone had a drink, and then she cleared her throat and let the room settle into quiet. And she told them how grateful she was that they had all come, and that in times of tragedy, family was what you had, and that she needed to address what she called, with a perfectly timed, trembling pause, the elephant in the room. She told them that I had been saying troubling things, that I had made accusations against her and Owen, that she didn't blame me because she knew I was suffering, but that she was afraid for me. And as the tears began to roll down her cheeks, precisely, without disrupting her mascara, the tears of someone who has practiced, Owen stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder and said in a flat, certain voice that I was clearly unwell and that they loved me but could not enable delusions. The room waited for my collapse. They were watching for the breakdown that would confirm everything they had been told. I stood in the center of their careful attention with my hands relaxed at my sides and said nothing. My expression was neutral. My spine was straight. I let them watch. I let them read my silence any way they needed to. The November light coming through the bay windows was beginning to stretch long and amber across the carpet, and my phone buzzed once in my pocket. A text from Dean. Warrant executed. At the gate. We have the bag. I said that I needed some air. I walked out the front door, past the American flag, into the cold February afternoon, leaving my mother mid-performance with her audience assembled and no act to follow. Before I take you inside that house for what happened next, if my mother's audacity, hosting a family gathering while a search warrant was already being executed on her property, has your jaw on the floor right now, hit that like and subscribe if you haven't already, because you cannot miss what happens in the next few minutes. Now back to the story. Dean's dark, unmarked SUV was idling 2 houses down in the shadow of an oak tree, and I slid into the passenger seat with my pulse hammering in a way I could feel in my fingertips, and he handed me his phone without a word and let the footage speak. The hallway camera, the building entry log timestamp. My mother walking in with the bag at 2:07 p.m. and walking out at 5:12 with empty hands. 3 hours and 5 minutes, not 30 minutes. And then the forensic photograph. The charred plastic and wiring fragments recovered from the origin point near the outlet behind my dresser. The remnants of a digital appliance timer with a serial number that traced back to a cash purchase at a Home Depot in Stamford, Connecticut, 8 days before the fire. A second photograph appeared on his screen. Grainy security footage from a retail checkout counter. A woman with familiar posture and familiar brown hair and a silk scarf I had given her as a Christmas gift. And in the lower right corner of the frame, a timestamp, 8 days before the fire, next to a register display that showed a total for 3 separate items purchased together in cash. My phone rang. Blair Voss. The insurance clerk, she said, had picked Sandra Harmon out of a 6-photo lineup without hesitation. He had identified the Chanel No. 5 as the specific scent. He had remembered the designer trench coat. He had remembered her saying her daughter was too busy at her design firm to come in herself. The detail that my mother had used my job, the job she had tried to have me fired from through an anonymous HR call, as part of her cover story at the insurance office, felt like the final rotation of a combination lock, the last tumbler clicking into place, the vault opening. I looked at the white-sided house through the car window. The living room light was on. I could see silhouettes moving behind the curtains. My family, still assembled, still waiting. Dean told me the warrant was complete. 2 uniformed officers from the local precinct were moving into position at the end of the driveway. He told me to stay in the car. I told him I was going back inside. He studied my face for a long moment, the way he'd studied every piece of evidence in this case, looking for structural weakness. and found none. He said 30 minutes, then we end this, and don't get in the way. Before I got out, he told me why this case had been personal for him. His sister, 15 years ago, an abusive ex-partner who had burned down her house while she worked a night shift, and the insurance company that had then implied she had done it herself for the payout, and the 3 years she had spent proving otherwise, at the cost of her health and her savings and her fundamental trust in institutions. He said that when he saw my file, mother listed as sole beneficiary without consent, fire with no accidental origin, he had recognized the shape of what was being done, and he had decided it was not going to end the same way. I walked back into my mother's living room with the quietest possible entrance and stood near the doorway. The room had settled into the anxious, suspended quiet of a group of people waiting for a scene to resolve. My mother looked at me, and something moved behind her eyes, a flicker of animal wariness, when she saw that I was not crying, was not shaking, was in fact the calmest person in the room. She recovered immediately, her voice and practiced, asking if I was feeling better, if I needed water. I said I had one question. The room went still. I asked her why she had stayed in my apartment for 3 hours and 5 minutes on February 7th when she had told me it was a 30-minute drop-off. She blinked. Her hand tightened slightly around her wine glass, a movement so small that only someone who had been watching for it would have caught it. And she said she didn't remember exactly, that it was a long drive from Greenwich and she had probably just lost track of time. I told her the building had high-definition cameras and that Dean Alcott had seen the footage, and I said it plainly and without anger and with the specific calm of someone who no longer needs to perform anything. Owen straightened by the fireplace, all the blood going out of his face. I asked about the Nike bag, the large black one, the one that had been heavy going in and absent coming out. She said she didn't know what I was talking about, and her voice had dropped an octave and shed everything that had made it warm. I told her the fire investigators had found the timer. The silence that followed that sentence was the particular silence of a room in which 15 people are simultaneously understanding that the story they believed they were in is not the story they are actually in. Aunt Claire's mouth was open. Kyle had set down his drink. Uncle Ray was shaking his head slowly, the slow, uncomprehending shake of a man confronting something he cannot yet process. Owen's phone rang, and he looked at the screen and went the color of old paper. My mother's phone rang at the exact same moment. They looked at each other across the living room, the silent communication of two people realizing simultaneously that the architecture they have built is coming down around them. Owen said her name, just her name, in a voice that had already given up. The doorbell rang. 3 heavy, authoritative knocks. Uncle Ray opened the door. Dean Alcott stepped across the threshold with his gold badge on his belt and 2 uniformed officers behind him, and he crossed the room in 4 deliberate steps, and the sound of his boots on the hardwood was the most final sound I had ever heard. He said my mother's full name and told her she was under arrest for arson in the 2nd degree, insurance fraud, and forgery, and she screamed. Not the practiced, mascara-controlled tears of her earlier performance, but a raw, animal sound, the sound of a cornered thing. And she turned to the room and told them I had set her up, that I was the sick one, that I had always hated her, and no one moved to stand beside her. The handcuffs clicked into place. Owen took one step toward her and was stopped by the second officer, who told him quietly that they had questions for him regarding conspiracy and gambling debts. And Owen, who had put his hand on her shoulder 20 minutes ago and told the room she was the one worth believing, said in a voice that was nothing but air, "It was her idea. All of it. She said the insurance would cover the debt. She said no one would get hurt." My mother screamed his name like a warning, like a curse, and it was too late, and the room had heard everything. Quick pause here. If you've ever had to choose yourself over the family you were told to protect in order to simply survive, type "I had to" in the comments. Choosing your own survival is never a betrayal. It is the most honest thing you will ever do. And if this story gave you even 1 ounce of that courage, hit that like and subscribe, because the fallout from Sandra Harmon's arrest is something nobody in Greenwich saw coming. Let me tell you what happened next. I watched them lead her out the front door, past the American flag and the manicured hedges, and she did not look back. And the police cars pulled away with their lights moving silently through the suburban dark. And for a long time after that, the living room was completely quiet. The room felt smaller without the performance filling it, the way a stage feels smaller after the lights come down and the production is over. Aunt Claire rose from her chair and walked toward me, her face wet, her expensive silk blouse wrinkled for the first time I could remember. And what she said, "I'm so sorry. I should have asked. I should have listened," arrived quietly, without defense or elaboration, the apology of a person who understood exactly what had been done in the name of protecting a narrative. One by one, they came to me across that living room. Kyle, Dana, Uncle Ray, the others, each of them carrying the specific weight of people who had been used as props in a plan they had not known they were part of. Uncle Ray took both my hands and said, whatever I needed, legal fees, a place to stay, that there was real family left when the false kind was removed. I thanked him. I walked out into the February night and breathed air that smelled of nothing except cold, clean, and stripped of everything. No Chanel No. 5, no BBQ smoke, no performance. The court date came on a gray Thursday in April. I sat in the back row of the courtroom and watched my mother in an orange jumpsuit, her hair grown out enough that the gray roots were showing. No upscale Greenwich salon appointments from Rikers Island. And she looked smaller, which was a word I had never applied to her before. The judge sentenced Sandra Harmon to 6 years in state prison for arson in the 2nd degree, insurance fraud in the 1st degree, and forgery. Owen Mercer, who had cooperated fully with the DA, received 18 months suspended sentence, 2 years probation, and mandatory treatment for the gambling addiction that had started everything. The debts at Mohegan Sun that had grown beyond what any income could service, the mortgage falling behind, the desperate arithmetic of a couple who had decided that the easiest asset to liquidate was a daughter's life. Blair Voss filed the restraining order the same afternoon. Permanent, unambiguous, clean. The insurance settlement cleared 8 weeks later, $142,000 after Blair's fees. I moved into a studio apartment in Cobble Hill, a quiet part of Brooklyn with old trees on the block and a hardware store on the corner where the owner knew people's names. New locks, new security system, no ghost of anyone's perfume in the hallways. Cole helped me carry boxes. Aunt Claire sent a new set of ceramic plates. I bought a Martin D28 acoustic, a beautiful guitar with its own particular voice, deeper and warmer than what I had lost. Not a replacement for my father's Gibson, but a new beginning, a different chapter that didn't need to be a copy of the one that had burned. The letter arrived 2 months later in a pale envelope from the State Women's Correctional Facility. The handwriting on the front unmistakably hers, neat, entitled, practiced. I opened it because I needed to know what she said. She said she'd had time to think. She said I needed to understand she had been desperate. She said Owen's debts had been crushing them both. She said she had thought the insurance would help everyone. She said I was still her daughter. She said I was still her baby. She asked me to visit. She signed it, Love, Mom. I read it twice, with the same slow, deliberate attention I had given every document in this case. And then I put it through the paper shredder and watched it turn into thin white ribbons that landed in the wastebasket like confetti. Patricia. Sandra. You were my mother. But the woman who was supposed to be my mother died the morning you stood in my apartment with a digital timer in a black bag and a box of store-bought cookies in your hand, and let me make you tea and tell you I was glad you had come. I don't know who you are now, and I don't need to find out. I blocked the prison mail. I blocked Owen's number. I changed every password, every account, every shared access point. Clean and final. I am sitting in my new apartment in Cobble Hill now, and it is late afternoon, and the light coming through the window is warm in the specific way that late winter light in Brooklyn is warm when it finally arrives after the long gray stretch of February. And I have been thinking about what fire actually does, which is not only destroy. It destroys, yes, but it also reveals. It burns away the insulation that has been keeping the truth at a comfortable distance. It shows you, without ambiguity or softness, exactly who is standing in the ashes and exactly who walked away before the smoke cleared. I lost my father's guitar, and I lost the photographs, and I lost the version of my mother I had been trying to protect for 29 years, because the alternative, admitting what she was, had always felt like losing something I couldn't afford to lose. Turns out, what I couldn't afford to lose was myself. Turns out, those are different things. The blood in your veins is not the same as loyalty. The name on your birth certificate is not the same as love. The woman who carried you is not automatically the woman who will not watch you burn for a check. If you are watching this, and you are in a family that makes you feel crazy for standing up for the truth, you are not crazy. You are just awake. And being awake is the beginning of everything. I am Lily Harmon. I am 29 years old. My mother tried to burn my life down for $150,000. She failed. Not because I was lucky, but because I stopped protecting people who had decided I was an asset to be liquidated. You are allowed to save yourself. You are allowed to choose your survival, especially from the people who made you believe that doing so was a betrayal. The fire took my things. It could not take my spine. And in the end, that is the only thing that was ever really mine. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story made you feel less alone tonight, drop a heart in the comments. And if you know someone who needs to hear this right now, share it with them. I'm Lily Harmon, and I am still standing. And if you're in your own fire right now, you will be too.